and I turn it over to Shoshana.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's great to see so many faces, most familiar, some new, so that's always exciting. And I'm very excited to introduce our guest tonight, Kalfani Ture. And I'm going to read a little bit of his bio because it's very impressive and it'll tell you a little bit about what he's been doing. Amid anti-racial protests and calls to end police violence in America, Kalfani Ture has emerged as one of the nation's leading experts on policing. He is a former police officer and assistant professor in criminal justice at Quinnipiac and a senior fellow in the Urban Ethnography Project at Yale University. And he offers a unique perspective on matters of race and law enforcement.
You don't care.
I do care.
But you don't care.
Shoshana?
You don't help.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure.
Kate? Kate, are you there? I'm sorry. I'll try and reach her to have her mute. Go ahead.
In addition, he obtained, we went through that already. Let me just see, I'm going to go back down to the bottom. Currently, he's interested in exploring the ethnographic encounters of law enforcement towards stigmatized and urban African Americans. He is also co-writing a publication.
Your speaker is not working?
Black People Should Train the Police. He's got a couple of book projects underway, which I'm sure he'll share with us. And I want to also give a shout out to Rachel Bashevkin, who alerted me to Professor Ture and the work that he's doing. And I'm just super excited to have you here speaking to our group. And so I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So I'm just going to activate my shared screen and just have to see how to how do you know what to do? So I just have to see how to
go up, and there you
you're
go,
probably
to the right a little bit, and you see that thing that looks like a screen right by your cursor?
Okay, sure. Right here?
It's no, on the other side. It looks like a standing projection screen.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, so it was just blocking the thing. So I first and foremost just want to thank you all for inviting me. I must admit I am somewhat overwhelmed with a quelling sensation because I get so excited in terms of talking about police, particularly to communities that I don't normally have this conversation with, because I firmly believe that policing is a necessary institution. Unfortunately, I'm not an abolitionist, but I know that in order to effectively reform policing, we need a multi-ethnic, a multiracial, a multitude of people coming to the table to have an honest conversation about policing and what we envision it to be, what we imagine it to be in the future. So I am just a little excited about this conversation, albeit informal. But I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I certainly want to give the proverbial shout out to Rachel. It's good to see you, albeit virtually. So today I want to, as the title here is Policing Black and White with Blue Fragility. And really what I want to get to in this conversation is to sort of talk about what blue fragility is and why I think it is important for us to at least consider it or consider this social phenomenon if our intentions are to effectively reform policing. So with that being said, I want to alert you that my next slide has, by the way, my personal pronouns is he and him. But I want to alert you that there is one graphic image on the next slide. So just a warning for anyone who might be triggered by it. So this is a sort of pictorial slide, if you will, of Officer Yanez, Geronimo Yanez, and Philando Castile. And many of you might, in fact, be familiar with Philando Castile. So I'm going to give you the sort of biographical conversation here, and then sort of explain why I'm showing this as the sort of first slide. Philando was a 32-year-old African-American. Officer Geronimo Yanez is 28 years of age. Philando is African-American. Officer Yanez is Hispanic-American. And they're both, or the incident took place in Minnesota. Philando actually, interestingly enough, is born in St. Louis, not too far from Ferguson. If what we know about Ferguson is true, this is not the first moment that he's had to sort of encounter a very sort of punitive and very racialized style of policing. In fact, prior to this sort of fatal incident, he was stopped more than 4 times and cited multiple times for minor traffic violations. So anyway, Philando was murdered on July 6, 2016, roughly 4 years ago. To put that in some perspective when we think about sort of George Floyd. And he was accompanied by his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, and her 4-year-old daughter. And the encounter, which many of you may in fact be familiar with, but there's this traffic stop for this minor sort of, not even a moving violation, right? Like a mechanical violation on his car. And in the small exchange with the officer, he explains that he's reaching for his license essentially, but he also has a legal permit to carry a firearm. And in the process of reaching for his license, as was instructed by Officer Yanez, Officer Yanez then shoots directly at him, point blank range, 7 times, hitting Philando 5 times. Philando dies that evening or at least pronounced dead, at Hennepin County Medical Center at about 9:37 p.m. Now, this incident created a major uproar around the country, as it should have, but it represents what I would argue sort of the more dramatic incidents of violence between police and African American and other marginalized communities. Now, to say that it represents, something more violent is to suggest that there is a continuum of sort of violent encounters that occur between law enforcement and these communities. And often what we become apprised with are these more dramatic incidents where there's lethal force. I would simply argue that, in fact, policing encounters, there are other types of less violent police encounters that we just don't hear about, right? Because for the mass media, obviously it's not sensational enough, but certainly African Americans, Latinx, members of the LGBTQ and A communities, and other marginally situated citizens such as women complain about sort of excessive use of force, et cetera. So I just want to give you a roadmap of where this is going to go. I didn't know my biography or a brief biography was going to be shared. I may share a few more points here, not to be redundant, but I think it's certainly relative to my sort of perspective on law enforcement and the possibility of reform and what prevents reform from happening. I want to sort of theoretically, or give a theoretical grounding, if you will, of how I'm thinking through police violence, but also the possibility of police becoming or serving the citizens effectively and with equal protection under the law. I want to get at the heart of blue fragility, which I think is probably the thing that I'm most interested in. And then I think it's important to talk about interventions as much as we sort of diagnose the problems. And so I want to look at sort of the historical, or at least provide a historical understanding, which I think offers us an antidote, if you will, not only for police violence and the lack of accountability, but for blue fragility, which I argue is a problem. And then, of course, in with the conclusion, open questions. I do want to say that if any of you have any questions, feel free to interrupt, because I was told that this was really going to be a casual conversation, and I just thought I would make a few slides here just to guide my thoughts. And so I don't want this to appear as formal as it may appear. So with that being said, I'm from Newark, New Jersey. And Newark was part of 159 plus cities in 1967, well, between 1967 and 1968, that experienced urban uprisings. I mentioned that I'm from Newark, New Jersey, because I was born shortly after the Newark riots, where a taxi driver, an African-American taxi driver, was pulled over and arrested for a minor traffic violation, which was he was following another vehicle too closely. And what we say in law enforcement, following too closely, which if the vehicle before you, for whatever reason, have to stop, there's not enough distance, and you in fact it may result in an accident. But in fact, he was arrested for this cabbie, and he was brutally beaten by police officers from the 7th Avenue Police Department. And the city protested this violence. In fact, the rumor was that this cabbie was near death. In fact, he was beaten that bad. My relatives would share these photos or whatever of this cabbie and show news clippings, and you can just see the blood just all over this guy. And so there was a fear that he wasn't going to make it, and moreover that the Newark Police Department wasn't offering any medical assistance to him. There's not too much difference in between that account and what we've seen recently. But anyway, so I say I'm from Newark because I grew up hearing these stories about violent police encounters. And I grew up in a single parent household, but I had, 4 or 5 uncles. And I can't tell you how many times I've had that talk with my uncles on how to comport oneself when confronted by law enforcement. And what makes it even that much more ironic is that I grew up in a household of Black police officers. So the fear of police violence was, in fact, something that was palpable, and it was just a matter of when your turn would arrive, right? Not so much of how much you could avoid it, but it would happen, and so you had to prepare for the moment. I attended Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, Georgia State, American University for my PhD, and of course I met your colleague here, wonderful colleague and friend of mine, Rachel, at Yale University, as part of Elijah Anderson's urban ethnography project, where I was a postdoc. And I sought out the postdoc for the opportunity to both study with Elijah Anderson, but also to study with other faculty who were in the sociology department. My PhD, however, is in the field of anthropology, and that will become clear because I am particularly interested in ethnography. In terms of law enforcement, I do want to qualify part of the introduction to say that I'm a former police officer. I sought out a career with Georgia State Police, the City of Roswell Police, which you all, if you are tuned to the news, 2 years ago, I think, we were in the news because officers would flip a coin to decide whether or not they were going to make a custodial arrest for minor traffic violations. So again, policing has a problem. And I ended my career with the Cherokee County Sheriff Department, which is a county police agency that is part of the Atlanta metropolitan area, but it's sort of situated on the northwest sort of side of Atlanta. I chose a short career of roughly about 5 years in law enforcement because I knew that I wanted to be sort of an advocate. I also wanted to be an educator, and I wanted to be a change maker because I grew up in this household with African-American officers who I knew put on their uniform, badge and gun to make a difference, and that I grew up in a very violent city. And I know, just as when I was a child, we do need law enforcement. But I felt that I could be the change agent. I could gather enough sort of insider knowledge in law enforcement to work on the outside to improve the institution. So in terms of my research and teaching, well, teaching is easy. I teach roughly 2 courses at Quinnipiac, and soon to be 3 courses, which is research methods, and I teach policing, and I'm teaching a course, 3rd course that I've developed, original course called The Ethnography of Police and Race. With that being said, I am an ethnographer, and I really appreciate ethnography. It is a different epistemological sort of approach to the production of knowledge. And not getting into the weeds of sort of disciplinary warfare or orientation warfare between quantitative researchers and qualitative researchers, I will simply sort of submit here that ethnography allows me to give you the context that the statistics don't give you. And so to draw from Mos Def, who is a rap artist, he says, the one straw broke the camel's back because there were 99 straws with stories attached. And so I simply want to offer the stories. And that's what I do in ethnography. I'm not necessarily looking for what we call in social science sort of a nomothetic principles. I'm not looking for general laws, but I'm looking to sort of deep dive into particular social and local social phenomenon with the hopes that I can arrive at some deeper understanding that then can be tested, right, by quantitative scientists. What is ethnography? Well, the textbook definition of ethnography, as offered here by Simpson and Coleman, is that it's just simply a recording and an analysis of the culture or of a culture or a social phenomenon or a society, usually based on this idea of sort of participant observation, which simply means that I would place my body alongside of and in the company of or in the environment of those who I seek to understand or the phenomenon that I seek to make sense of. And then ethnography is not only a method, but it's a product. The resulting aspect of ethnography is this written account of people, places, or institutions. Now, Elijah Anderson, if I can borrow from his definition, since Rachel is here, Anderson makes the case that ethnography is this attempt to apprehend a particular social phenomenon or a culture or a group of people, to comprehend how they navigate and negotiate with the contingencies, the everyday contingencies, the questions and decisions that they have to make. And that's even more so when you are a marginal or a vulnerable citizen. And to depict it in a way that allows those who are the audience of that ethnography to draw their own interpretations. Now, I am going to slightly add on or push back against that definition. We live in a society that is deeply sort of marked or characterized by differentials in power. And because that's the case, then I would argue, different from this sort of static or stated notion of what ethnography is, by saying that ethnography is political, even when the ethnographer chooses not to be political. And so if in fact ethnography is this political representation, this sort of effort to sort of grapple with these sort of differentials in power, then ethnography can't just simply be this sort of inductive approach to understanding social phenomena. That is, let the evidence on the ground sort of speak to you, and then you sort of develop theory on the back end. No, we have to come in with sort of as a priori sort of theories. We come in with ideas that we also want to test. Or we come in understanding the political nature, and we come in with the social justice agenda. I, in fact, went into law enforcement, I went into law enforcement with the social justice agenda too. But I went into sort of ethnographic practice with this idea that I wanted to make society better and fair and more equal. And so if I could just back up, well, I won't say the officer's name here, but I was with the Baltimore City Police Department, and I've been doing ethnographic work with in Baltimore for quite some years, studying a particular corridor. And so whenever I'm there, I do these ride-alongs, and it just happens that every so often I'll run into one of my friends there, and so that explains the bright smile on his face. But yeah, so this is me in the city of Baltimore. So in terms of structural violence, I'm going to talk about how this shapes my work and also shapes my understanding of law enforcement. But I do want to say that structural violence is a term that's often sort of ascribed to Johann Galtung and actually the Latin sort of liberation theology movement of the 1960s. And Johann Galtung simply says that it's a form of violence wherein some social structures or some institutions, he says may, but I should note they intentionally harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. And that's really, really important to understand. And it'll be even more important when I sort of work to sort of locate it in my own sort of theoretical framework. Paul Farmer, who is an anthropologist, sort of draws on Johann Galtung's definition. And Paul Farmer, who actually is looking at the relationship between the United States in particular, but the West in general, and their relationship to Haiti, and is asking this question, and not just so much about Haiti, but also other sort of nations within this hemisphere, but on the southern part of this hemisphere. He's saying, how is it that they have so much natural resources, but they suffer inequality at the global scale like no one could even imagine? How is it that it's such a lopside in wealth and power between a nation state like the US and Guatemala or Haiti, or et cetera? And so he draws on Johann Galtung's idea on structural violence to say that it's simply an affliction of the poor and the sick. It's a result of, it's an intentional result where neither culture nor the pure individual efforts of people, for example, in Haiti, could be held at fault. Rather, historically given, and he's very specific about paying attention to history, but he has some other important dimensions here that he asks us, or prescriptions that he asks us to look at. But he says that these are processes and forces that conspire to constrain individual agency, but also just the life chances of people. And so he looks, in fact, at the ways in which the US has increased the vulnerabilities of Haiti before and after, for example, the earthquake. And so I'm actually going to show his book in just a second. So I want to sort of discuss with you how structural violence sort of plays out in my own work, and sort of define for you the way in which I'm using it. I apologize that I'm looking down because I'm actually looking at my notes now. So again, this is an idea that sort of develops with Johann Galton.
Kalfani, can I
Yeah.
interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
We do have a question from Roger Colton. I think he had a comment a little earlier and now has a question. Roger, do you want to unmute yourself for a second?
Sure.
This is actually Sarah.
Oh, it's Sarah. Okay.
So what I was commenting earlier was, I work with Carol Ember, who's an ethnologist, and actually so does Ian. And we were talking this afternoon, and she was pointing out how an ethnographer has to, you can go ahead and observe, but still not catch on what's going on. She talked about one example being, she was listening to some boys talk. She'd worked in Kenya, and one boy said to another, "You look just like your mother." And she thought, "Isn't that sweet?" And then but an ethnographer always needs someone on the inside to help you interpret. And the interpreter was, "Yeah, but he just called him the worst insult ever. All boys are supposed to look like their fathers." And so you, by going to the police academy and being a policeman for 5 years, and managed to be an observer and a participant. I mean, so you've got both ends. But the question was, so are you saying with the, like in Haiti, the corruption wouldn't be as bad if the history wasn't so bad?
So the corruption wouldn't be as bad if the history wasn't so bad. The history of,
So in the earlier slide, you were talking about how it's not just culture and the individual, you've also got the history. Paul Farmer is saying the history is forcing you into this thing. So are you saying, for instance, Haiti's worse off than it would be if
So it's hard to know. It's hard to know how any particular individual or nation state would reach their potential. The assumption is, at least we assume, that they would certainly be better off, but we actually don't have the evidence of that, because what in fact precedes that is the violence, the hidden violence that is perpetrated against a nation state like Haiti by the US, right? But because we don't have access to the violence that's committed through policies and practices of the US at a scale to which obviously we are not privy to unless we study up and those who are in power allow us access, then all we're left with is really sort of the, problematic adaptive strategies, if you will, that Haitians in this case would deploy in order to just adapt to a materially, for example, deprived environment, right? Starvation, and this is just in sort of layman's terms, starvation is really problematic. It makes people do desperate things, right? For example, and there are, and I don't want to just reduce it to starvation, but there's other types of vulnerabilities that are exacerbated, if not created, by the lack of material access. So to answer your question, let's just say that Haiti would be much better if we were aware, even as American citizens, how the US in our name produces these uneven relationships where power is not equitably shared, nor are the resources. In fact, there is exploitation, and that those in power can hide or veil that exploitation, and then in return sort of blame those who suffer that inequality as being at fault. So, and I say that Haiti might be in a better situation because I doubt that the average American would tolerate the nation doing certain things in their name. Recent history showed us that.
Kalfani, I really don't want to cut you off. I'm finding it really fascinating. I think that in the interest of time, maybe if we can go further on in in this subject matter, and then we can pick that up at the end.
Okay, great. Sure.
Because I think it's I think the point is absolutely applicable theoretically. I just think that some people really would love to get to more of the meat of the essence of the discussion tonight.
Sure.
Okay,
so
Sarah, I hope that that's okay with you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for your question. And so let me run through really quickly this idea of the spatial binary. You all can see a sort of visual diagram probably on the right of your screen. And so this is just my way of sort of understanding, at least in my prior research site, how structural violence operates to ensure inequality is maintained or that the status quo is maintained. So I'm just going to backtrack just really quick and point out 5 prescriptions that Farmer says that we should be concerned with as social scientists. One, he says it is important that we pay attention to the historiography of structural violence, that violence always comes with history, right? And I'm going to make the case for history. Second thing he says is that we need to understand that violence is intentional, that there's an intentionality there. And I just think that that's something we should appreciate. And then the last 3 is, he says that violence operates across various axes of social identity. So African Americans might suffer violence, structural violence because of race. Women might suffer violence because of this sort of androcentric society, or what we call PMS, patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism that we exist in, more so now than, but that violence, the structural violence operates against marginal citizens, so no one sort of owns, this is not an Olympics for who is the most oppressed, and that we need to appreciate that. And I think that's important thinking about the solution of a multi-ethnic, multiracial sort of crime. And so the last 2 points here is that violence is always materially manifest. So look at the materiality of oppression and you will see it. So thinking about Philando Castile, the violence was manifest in his body, right? We all saw this sort of horrible and horrid images of his bullet whole body, right? But there's a materiality to it. And then finally, most importantly, there is a spatiality to it. So here, I sort of hone in on the sort of spatial dynamics, which in my prior research in Washington, D.C., I found that the police played a really important role here. But the thing that I want to add here, so the Farmer comes back and Farmer says that we also need to make visible those who engage in acts of violence. So the difference between the dramatic forms of violence, for example, with Officer Yanez and Philando Castile, that was a dramatic incident of violence, right? It was just really grotesque and jarring, but it was immediate and we saw it and we could perceive it, etc. But most violence, according to Farmer, as well as Johan Galtung, is out of the view of those who often suffer from it. And so one of the things that we need to do is think about, well, what's the hidden culture? What is the hidden practice? What are the hidden policies, etc.? Now, thinking about the social spatial binary. So I was looking at displacement from public housing as part of this larger phenomenon of gentrification happening in Washington, D.C. And I was in a public housing community known as the Barry Farm Public Dwellings, or the Farms for short. And what I discovered there, when I began to think more critically about spatial violence, was that the ghetto itself served a very functional role for mainstream society or mainstream Washington, D.C. In other words, that the ghetto had to be proximate or there had to be an optimal spatial proximity between the ghetto, here I'm referring to the ghetto as a truly, truly disadvantaged others, and the Western Superior cultural group. Because it's what we call binary opposition. I don't define who I am by any sort of essential attributes of myself. I define who I am and my superiority vis-a-vis the other group. Now, if in fact the contradistinctive other is the ghetto, and there is no natural condition, I mean, no one wakes up aspiring to be materially deprived or to find insecure reality, then it has to be sort of manufactured. And what was interesting that I discovered was that the maintenance of the ghetto in part was shaped by police practices. In other words, police patrolled the periphery of this public housing community. They would often harass people who would leave outside of this public housing community, as well as harass people within the public housing community. They would, in law enforcement, we call it humbug charges in Georgia. They would provoke confrontations with everyday residents through constant harassment, or just stop, question, and frisk repeatedly within the same hour, the same day, and residents would push back, and this would escalate to some criminal charge. But the police were very instrumental in maintaining this sort of derelict space, and we can talk about how they went about it other than that. I just want to give you one example. A parent that I had worked with, because I moved into this community for about 6 months, and she went to pick her child up from school, and as she was walking her child home, who was about 6 years of age, he had to go to the bathroom really, really bad. And he didn't make it. He ended up going in the alleyway behind a tree. Well, in DC, we have what's called jump outs. These are police officers with no uniforms, no markings, no insignia to indicate that they're police officers. And they often ride around in unmarked cars. And so they jump from the vehicle, they snatch the 6-year kid up, threw handcuffs on him. And then when the mother finally made it around the corner, they begin to sort of assault her and make threats that they were going to file complaints with the local welfare office. And so they issued citations and things like that, all because this 6-year-old kid who tried to conceal himself used the bathroom outdoors, right? Which we may scoff at that depending on our sort of, class backgrounds, but I didn't see anything problematic about that. But this one incident took this parent from having absolutely no criminal record to now having a criminal record. And I've witnessed this quite a bit. Now, I do want to tell you about the socio-spatial binary. It has to be sort of relatively spaced, not too distant, and not sort of integrated. If it is integrated, then the constituent categories of this binary cease to have integrity. And it's hard to know, well, who is part of the Western Superior group or mainstream society, and who is part of this derelict or ghettoized space. And so we can come back to this sort of original theory at the end with questions, simply to say that this binary is maintained through structural violence, and that police played a very instrumental role in the structural violence. Now, I just want to point out, because invariably I'm often asked about sort of, well, can you point out some ethnographic works on policing? And I just wanted to point out, for some of you who are interested in reading ethnographies on policing, you want to take a screenshot, or if you want to jot down some names, I'll point out some of these works to you. There are not a lot of ethnographic manuscripts, book length, on police, but there are some really classic ones. And so the one in the middle, Violence in the Police by William A. Wesley, who was a sociologist. He was one of the first sociologists to do an ethnographic, perform ethnographic research on policing. Secondly, at the bottom, you see a book that's called Policing in the Community by Michael Banton. He was the first anthropologist to do an ethnographic study on policing. And they both actually conducted their work roughly around the same time. And so these represent two of the earlier ethnographic texts on policing. Then flanking the bottom, Tales of the Field, and this one that I'm holding up in my hand. Tales of the Field is John Van Manen. He's an ethnographer, and he's just having a discussion about ethnography and how ethnographers develop an authorial voice. But in his examples, he's using his ethnographic work on policing. And he's not too far. He's actually in Massachusetts at MIT, although I think he's retired now. And then in Atlanta, one of the books that I considered when I was in law enforcement there, the screen is sort of started there, but it's policing and the occupation and introduction of female officers. And what this Patricia Remington, who's an ethnographer and an anthropologist, she was just trying to determine if the introduction of women into law enforcement, particularly in Atlanta, would soften the edges, improve community relations, and just get rid of this sort of masculine bad boy image of policing and make it more humane. Now, surrounding that, you have Cop in the Hood on the top to the left, which isn't, I think, one of the most objective ethnographic texts on policing. I think Peter Moskos, who's the author, a sociologist who teaches at John Jay, I think he gets lost into his identity as policing, but I share his work because, like myself, he became a police officer, although for less, I think he was in law enforcement for approximately 2 years, just to conduct the ethnographic work. And some of the other ones here are really great. I just want to point out at the bottom before I move on to the next slide. I mentioned Paul Farmer here because he develops this idea of structural violence, and that's the book, Pathologies of Power. And then Condemnation of Blackness, which is on the bottom to the right, is Khalil Gibran. And his work, he's not an ethnographer, he's a historian, he's at Harvard. But he gives us
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute. I just want to do a time check it's now about 10 minutes before 9. And I want to make sure, because I know that people will start wanting to leave a little bit after 9. And I want to make sure you get to the main points that you have to make. It's all really interesting, but I want to just give you a little sense of where we are.
Sure. So I encourage you to read that. Now, Blue Fragility. And thank you again for that notice. Blue Fragility. I'm going to talk about this incident in the future, but this is a funeral for a fallen police officer. And the officers there at the funeral stood up in unison, turned their backs on Mayor de Blasio. And so I will talk about that in just a second. Let me sort of give you a definition of Blue Fragility, but let me say this to you. Despite the many campaigns that's been launched to end police violence against Black, Latinx, LGBTQ and A, against women and other minorities or people of color, I think this violence will continue. In fact, I will prognosticate that it will continue in dramatic form. Not that I want it to continue, but I think those of us who hope to intervene in police violence, we are not appreciating a certain aspect of police culture, which is to say Blue Fragility. And I want to be clear here. The proposals to reform policing to make police misconduct records more transparent between interagency transparency, but also transparency for everyday citizens, to improve de-escalation training, to defund agencies where we would take some of the sort of outsized budgets, municipal budgets that go to police departments and put them towards less punitive services that would help people who in fact are poor. These things are important and we should be pursuing these things. While these measures should be implemented, to include this idea that we should have co-responders with police department, such as social workers. I mean, it'd be great to see a social worker or a public health person respond to someone who is suffering, some acute issue related to addiction, than to have police officers respond, because it is a public health issue. But while these reforms are really, really important, and for example, you think about Minneapolis after Officer Yanez shot and killed Philando Castillo. Minneapolis implemented many of the reforms that are being suggested today. And so why do we have a George Floyd? And my argument is that blue fragility, which is less appreciated, is this set of defensive and protective strategies that police deploy. In fact, we are almost immediately acquainted with blue fragility as an important sort of aspect of policing culture and identity as soon as the initiate walks into the police academy. By the way, I've been in 3 police academies in my own training and passed all of them. But police deploy this sort of protective and defensive strategy when there is a question about their legitimacy and their moral authority. When we challenge law enforcement about their almost exclusive license to use lethal force or to use violent force at all. And really this fictional idea that law enforcement alone are suited to resolve violence and issues of public safety, or not violence, but certainly public safety, broadly speaking. And so these strategies are exampled, and I'll give some examples just in a second, but withdrawing from civil discourse, or silencing that discourse, or engaging in acts of verbal and physical aggression, or work stoppages, mass call-outs, or just other sort of demonstrated signs of insolence, as the previous photo that I showed, where the officers stood to their feet and turned their back at a funeral for one of their falling brothers. They turned their back on the mayor. But here's what you need to understand about blue fragility. That these responses, while they effectively shut down criticism, they work to restore police officers to their symbolic status as moral agents. They prevent meaningful change, but these, as we think about fragility, these are not acts of weakness. These are not law enforcement officers around the country, calling out because they've been injured by our criticism. In fact, these are acts of strength where they deploy these defensive sort of practices to maneuver or as maneuvers to parry criticism and deflect attention away from the structural problems of policing, and race.
Kalfani,
Yeah.
before you continue, I actually have a question. This is Daryl. My question is, where does the term blue fragility come from? In other words, who is someone imposing that on this observation, or does it come from within, is it an internal term, sort of code word within the police itself?
Sure. So I wanted to claim that it was an original idea, but in terms of this idea of the blue part. But Robert DiAngelo has this wonderful text I encourage you all to read, and it's called White Fragility. And she really lays out, she gives a theoretical framework, I think, for us to understand the sort of maintenance of white supremacy. How is the status quo maintained when the majority of the country are progressive and liberal and not racist, right? Why is it that it exists? And she lays out this wonderful framework, which basically explains how non-racists, in fact, support and why they support through inaction the privilege that they garner by way of whiteness. And maybe unwittingly or intentionally, they do so but this is the outcome. And I thought that this was a wonderful way of describing what I experienced in law enforcement and what these recent examples that I'm going to point out really quickly demonstrate. I do want to
So it's a term that you have coined personally, is what you're saying.
Oh, I don't want to take
fine.
full credit for it because white fragility is there, and I want people. I do want to direct people to Robin DiAngelo's work. I think it's an amazing. I think her work is amazing, and it has faced some criticism by several scholars, but I just think it's amazing, and so my evaluation of it is great. So yeah, blue fragility, but there is an idea that's out there also referred to as cop fragility. So you may see that in some of the literature, and there's a lot of overlap here. I was unaware of cop fragility because I was excited about this idea of blue fragility, but I do want to note that that also exists. And while it doesn't sort of neatly meet my idea, but it's very similar in some ways. But I want to point out some examples for you.
Wait,
So,
I'm sorry. We actually have another question, if
Sure.
you don't mind taking it. It's from Jane. Jane, if you would unmute.
Hi, sorry, you might actually be getting to this because I know that in your outline you said you'd get to historical understandings, but I wanted you to touch on maybe the history of policing and in the sense of how a long-established culture is maybe what we're sort of up against in terms of trying to change that culture, right? From what I understand, a lot of police forces were established prior to the Civil War even, so when, and there was some motivation, like, to serve as slave catchers, more right? Please forgive me if this is totally out of my range, my wheelhouse. But yeah, please clarify.
and no, you're absolutely correct, and I'm going to get to that. And you just guys just let me know how much time we have. But I just want to give a few examples about blue fragility in action, and then I want to get to the history because I think I think that history, Jane, is the antidote or one of the antidotes to this issue, and it will allow us to move reform forward. Yeah, we have a really interesting relationship with history, and I definitely want to get to that. It's important here. So the Atlanta police officers, Officer Roof and Officer Garrison, when they encountered the motorists in the drive-through sleep. So 2 questions I have, right? So you had this massive call-out, work call-out after the 2 officers were indicted. And so the police in unison to protect the image of policing engaged in this act of protest or this act of blue fragility, right? But they never allowed for the question to be answered or never even entertained the question, did these 2 officers have to make a custodial arrest? And did they in fact have to use violence to apprehend, at this point, the fleeing suspect? And the question is no. The 5 top clusters of COVID-19, which we were talking about at the beginning of this sort of conversation, the top 5 clusters are in jails and prisons. Then you have nursing homes, and then you have, general sort of quarters in society. So they simply could have performed a citation and escorted the individual home. They didn't have to make a custodial arrest. Second thing is, the officer Roof didn't have to use lethal force because law enforcement know that, one, the taser is ineffective anywhere 15 feet outside. And furthermore, I believe from what the many sort of images that I saw, it was set for what we call a contact tase. In other words, they were in a ground fight with this guy, and so their tasers were set not to deploy the prongs, but for contact. And I think both officers may have been aware of this. Either way, it was a non-lethal weapon, and he was trying to flee. The officers simply could have called what we call Signal 59 and alerted backup where there was sufficient number and then apprehend him. So, but the officers decided to do a massive call out of work, which, weaken the system, and it was a way to get back at the mayor. Think about the city of Buffalo. When the emergency response team pushes the 70-plus-year-old gentleman back, and he strikes his head and suffers traumatic brain injury. In fact, you all might be familiar with this. And those officers, when the two who pushed the gentleman were indicted, those 57 other members of this response team decided to resign from this unit. Not resign from law enforcement, but to resign from this unit. And what was never asked or entertained there was whether or not we needed a 1033 clad, sort of military clad response unit to what was documented as a peaceful protest a few blocks away, a peaceful protest. And you think about the public display of no confidence for the Mayor de Blasio. I should tell you that every given opportunity, officers will turn their back on Mayor de Blasio. So he's very circumspect when it comes to sort of public events where officers are involved. But the reason why they turned their back on him, because Mayor de Blasio has a biracial son, and he was having that father-to-son talk about how you should comport yourself when in the presence of police, particularly since his son is biracial and phenotypically sort of appears as an African American. And then I want to talk about two final things that I think are examples of blue fragility. Think about the Laquan McDonald situation in Chicago, where the officers, and there were several officers at the scene, and all of their police reports or incident reports supported the use of force by Officer Van Dyke. And where if you would read all these police reports, it would seem to any sort of objective and reasonable person that Laquan McDonald was lunging towards them with his weapon, and he was going to cause immense harm, which visual evidence sort of belies that point. So thinking about blue fragility, officers will enter into the land of mendacity. And I've seen this during my own professional time in law enforcement, not necessarily to protect other officers, but to protect the institution itself. And the byproduct is that other officers are off the hook. And then finally, Blue Lives Matter. Blue Lives Matter is an interesting retort to Black Lives Matter. Because what in fact does, and this is going to sort of get into some of the police union stuff. You know, in law enforcement, police unions encourage what we call our command staff, but also encourage rank and file officers, that there's three sort of strategic responses you should deploy when in fact you are involved in a critical incident, a questionable critical incident. The first one is to drudge up as much negative propaganda on the suspect. And if the suspect doesn't have a criminal record, then the second step goes into play, which is to convince everyday citizens how tough the work conditions or the precarity that police officers experience because of their work conditions. In other words, you want to win the sympathies of everyday citizens. And third, if that doesn't work, then you just be silent, because the assumption is that Americans have short attention spans, and we are historically that we suffer from historical amnesia. So we don't pay attention to critical incidents that long because there's always some other competing distraction, and then we don't reflect on these things. And shortly I will get to the history, but which is to say that Blue Lives Matter is this almost surgical response to the call for Black Lives Matter and the different demonstrations to local, state, and federal governments for police accountability, which is to say that bona fide victims of police violence are almost surgically reinterpolated as societal ruffians. And that police then are effectively able to call on would-be sympathizers or citizen sympathizers to sort of commiserate with their work conditions. And so I think that these are in most recent time, these are, examples of blue fragility in action. Now,
Kalfani, I'm just going to break in again. It's about 9:05, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to maybe wrap things up in the next 5 minutes and then leave a little bit of time for questions if that's possible. And also, I would like to give you a chance to talk about the Center for Ethnographic Study that you're putting together.
Sure. So history. I think that history is so important. As it's as important as an antidote to blue fragility, but it's one solution amongst many solutions that will help law enforcement officers and the communities they serve, and the communities who are interested, the stakeholders who are interested in reform, come together to make meaningful changes. When I left the police academy the first time and I entered the community, I discovered almost immediately that I was too Black for the blue uniform, but I also discovered that I became too blue for the Black community. So I found myself out on an island. And it was painful, but I understood why. Because, at least for my community, most members of my community are aware of the history of police violence. They are aware of through direct experience, indirect experience, sort of vicarious experience, and maybe because of the fact that African Americans tend to trade their war, or to exchange or trade war stories in stride. We meet at barbecues, picnics, cookouts, block parties, family reunions, and it is not unlikely for us to exchange stories of our negative encounters with police. And so the Black community, and perhaps other marginalized communities, are aware of that history. But many of the white officers that I work with, many of the female officers that I work with, the Asian and Latinx officers that I work with, like me, wanted to make a difference. But unlike me, were unaware of that history. So as to say that the uniform, the gun and the badge, when encountering a marginal citizen, it is drenched with a history of racialized violence. So let's talk about this history. Often we attribute policing in the US to Robert Peel and what we call the Peelian principles. In fact, that we would apply Robert Peel's principles about policing, I doubt that we would have the type of violence that we have, racialized violence, which suggests that there's another sort of motivation around policing these communities. Policing in the US has two different trajectories. It starts in the Northeast and it starts in the South. First, let me just tell you, and I'm just kind of brushing over this history. I apologize that I got lost with time. So in the Northeast, there was a concern about Eastern, Central, and Southern Europeans disrupting the status quo of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now, Irish people had been here, and they had always been seen as this sort of dangerous class. So policing itself in the Northeast is targeted towards Irish, but it's also targeted towards the Polish, towards members of the Jewish community, towards Italians, etc. Because there was always a concern by sort of the barons of the day that they didn't want labor to be disrupted. And they didn't want the market to be disrupted by people who were experiencing life at the bowels of society, right? And who were being exploited. So I'll just leave that there. So it's important to understand that history and appreciate that history because it shows you how loose and how much of a social construction race or the so-called other is. Now, as for the South, policing begins in the South. It begins well before the American Revolution. In fact, the American Revolution is not just about tea in the harbor. It's not just about sort of the quarter tax or sort of invasions of privacy, the seizure of property, the unjust seizure of property. The American Revolution is also about slavery. And I can't go into Somerset versus Stuart, but I would simply say that the English courts determined that slavery was a crime against humanity. And so those in the US had to decide whether we were going to prolong slavery or whether we were going to end it according to the sort of decrees set forth by the mother country. Well, you know the end story. This is why most of the founding fathers, in fact, owned slaves. And in as much as slavery is not mentioned in the founding documents, although the South wanted it to be so, there was nothing affirmative in those documents that captured the humanity of these sort of bonded or in bondage people. Now, so you have early on this concern about both free Black populations or free African populations, African American populations, but you also have a concern around those who in fact would escape from slavery. So you have these what's referred to as paddy rollers or slave patrollers. Slave patrollers operated in 5 to 6 individuals, a top horse, but they had tracking dogs, and they would move about. Now, the policing that begins well before in the Northeast, before we have sort of formalized policing that comes about in the early part of the 19th century, was what we call a sort of night watch system that evolved to what a day watch system. But these were people that were pretty much immobile, sat in towers and waited for what we call a hue and cry. In other words, to be activated around some emergency, and then they would leave their tower and they would go sort of try to intervene and capture the bad guy. However, in the South, the patrollers were mobile. They were on horses. They moved about. They patrolled. And what they patrolled what was called a beat, a certain amount of acreage. They were responsible for patrolling. And today in law enforcement, we refer to police patrols or the beats. And so this sort of legacy of slavery is still with us, even if it's just in the vernacular. And so you have a lot of different acts here. I do want to point out, however, and I know I'm like short on time, but Michel de Roth-Trouillot's point is that history is a fruit of power, and power itself is never so transparent that its analysis becomes superfluous. In fact, he goes on to say that what's remarkable about power is invisibility, and that we must expose the roots of power. And so part of looking at this power differential and thinking about structural violence and thinking about this culture of blue fragility and this sort of instruction around blue fragility is to sort of use history to get at this differential of power. So this is why power is so important. But you have the Fugitive Slave Act. You have actually 2 of them. So you have the first police department that sort of develops around sort of the capture of slaves, at least by the federal government, are federal marshals. But prior to that, you have these sort of informal paddy rollers who are responsible or going around and capturing these slaves or interacting with them to confirm that they have the right of passage. In other words, that they have passes to be outside of their owner's property or owner's plantation. Now, this is really important to appreciate because those who were conscripted into the system of paddy rollers in the South could in fact been the elite, or it could have been the average white citizen. In other words, that whiteness itself begins to be imbued with a certain property, a certain value over that of Black bodies. This is also important because it is at this point in the South that we get what's called lateral policing. These are individual citizens who act in the capacity of law enforcement, but do not have the license nor the training to operate. So 9/11, we had this campaign by way of Metro Transit in New York who started it, see something, say something. and we recruited everyday citizens to sort of be the eyes and ears of the street. This is nothing more than slavery's old lateral policing system, where everyday citizens without training were recruited into this system, this sort of network of surveillance and also punitive interventions. I don't want to go over the list here. The list is recent, you all know it. There are moments when African Americans, for example, are jogging or walking through Central Park or sitting on a sofa, falling asleep in the dormitories at Yale, or eating lunch at Smith College in Massachusetts or wherever. And we have citizens weaponizing the police against them. And their rationale is, well, I saw something out of place and I called it. So there's this issue of lateral policing. But what happens in the South is that you begin to see this sort of incipient stages of this sort of consolidation of whiteness. Now, labor historians, Roediger, for example, says that this consolidation takes, roughly 40 to 50 years. After this, Reconstruction era into the mid 20th century. But there is this consolidation to the point where in the North, Eastern, Central, and Southern Europeans cease to be ethnic Europeans, and they're now sort of categorized in this group of white people. But let me get into whiteness. But so you have the Fugitive Slave Act, and you have this sort of development in the South for policing, and they use slave codes, right? These were sort of restrictions or proscriptions around the practices appropriate for slaves. And if slaves broke these rules, they could not only face physical violence, but they also could, in fact, they could be, they would face physical violence, but they could also be returned to the master and sold further south into places like New Orleans. The Civil War happens, the Reconstruction era commences. Interestingly enough, Black police officers, along with African Americans in politics, come about. And in the South, because there is this investment now in whiteness against that of Blackness, where one becomes superordinate, the other one becomes subordinate. This becomes part of the social code, if you will. When African Americans are granted not only the 13th Amendment, but the 14th and 15th Amendment, they're granted citizenship, and they're ostensibly being brought in as full citizens, which is breaking this sort of social arrangement of the South. And it got really bad. So there was, like lynchings, and there was all kinds of things happening. Ulysses S. Grant had to send in the federal troops in to protect the interests of slaves, or the ex-slaves, or ex-enslaved African Americans. And the Reconstruction moment happens, but there's this sort of arrangement where the federal troops are pulled out of the South, and the Ku Klux Klan emerges to reestablish a social order in which slavery itself produced. Orlando Patterson writes in the social, in Slavery and Social Death, he says that there's two types of interpolations of Black bodies coming out of enslavement. He says, one, you have physical death. But he says, like physical death is something, it happens and it's done. He says, the more dangerous type of death that happens to Black people is the social death. In other words, that their very bodies are open to all kinds of sort of valuable treatments. They are criminalized. And this is important to appreciate, because even though you had the Midnight Marauders, or otherwise known as the Ku Klux Klan, you had, because of the 13th Amendment and this sort of gaping loophole, which said that if these recently freed Blacks were convicted of a crime, then they could be entered back into what amounts to slavery or enslavement. And so at this point, post the Reconstruction era, roughly around 1877, you see this mass criminalization not mass incarceration, and not mass murder, even though there were a lot of lynchings that were happening, there was a lot of violence that happened. You didn't want to kill essentially your laborers, right? So you have this mass criminalization, and African Americans have returned to the plantations through what we call convict leasing. Jim Crow continues into the mid-20th century. The Civil Rights era happens. There is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious movement against Jim Crow and all the legacies of Jim Crow. And all the race riots, in fact, that happened leading up to that moment are, by and large, whites and in the South and the North trying to reestablish a particular social order that allowed them to be the sort of superordinate citizens and African Americans to be socially subordinate. Now, so one of the questions that we have in closing, one of the questions that we have is, how did we get here? Well, there is this sort of continuity that stretches back into enslavement of African people and goes unbroken and uninterrupted into the present. And in a moment where we've enjoyed the presidency, two-term presidency of an African American, in a moment where even though the idea of post-racialism doesn't necessarily match the material conditions, African Americans are starting to see themselves as full citizens as opposed to provisional citizens. Now, it's important to understand this in closing. Race is a primary organizing principle in the society. And it means that if, in fact, you are classified as white, you're considered a scrupulous citizen with decent morals, and you have what Edison calls high credibility. Conversely, if you are African American, you're considered unscrupulous, you have no credibility, you lack moral authority, or you have limited to no moral authority, and you're constantly sort of perceived as what we call a symbolic Black assailant. In other words, you are a perpetual criminal waiting to be discovered. And policing then, who guards that interstitial space, who guards the sort of spatial separation of these groups, who guards the social order of the day, they are attributed with the highest level of moral authority, legitimacy, and we often extend to them a wide latitude of power, whether it be the use of violence, to reinforce or reestablish the social order. So police then don't have to be racist. I didn't work with racist officers. I did work with officers who didn't evolve to become anti-racist, but I didn't necessarily work with a lot of racist officers. I just worked with officers who were expected to go out and enforce laws that maintained a particular social order that disadvantaged African Americans, but that also advantaged white society. I apologize about the time. I thought this was longer. I'll stop there and open up for some questions. I sort of covered history without the amount of detail that I wanted to give to it, but I think that that's sufficient to understand that there is continuity here. And so that when we see a George Floyd or a Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery, when we see Corinne Gaines, or when we see a Tamir Rice or a Michael Brown, and by the way, we're seeing this around the country, not just in some isolated region, it suggests, at least for the ethnographer, that there is something, there's not a coincidence here, but that this is patterned. And that as an ethnographer, then I want to set out to discover what informs that cultural pattern. This is not isolated in a given moment, but it certainly has antecedents that are uninterrupted, a chronology that is uninterrupted. And so I think that history itself becomes an important antidote, not necessarily for those who are victims of police violence, but police themselves. I've been in 3 police academies, and I've never taken a course in the police academy on the history of police, the history of policing, or the history of policing and race. Thank you.
Kalfani, we have a question from Rachel. Rachel, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I think I unmuted. Kalfani, a question for you about New Haven specifically. I know you spent some amount of time around New Haven police and you've been living around here for a few years. Any opinion you want to render about New Haven police and anything you want to suggest to us as mostly New Haven residents, not exclusively so, about what we can do as community members?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question, Rachel. I think this is a really important question. First thing I'm going to tell you is that I think we all need to be hopeful. Because when we lose hope, then we just surrender ourselves to a status quo that doesn't work for none of us. But we will certainly, almost guaranteed, see more incidents of violence. Second thing is, New Haven is particularly interesting. I don't know if it still has or maintains the dubious distinction of being number 4 or the top 10 most violent cities per capita in the country. I know that Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven were in the top 15, which is odd to have 3 cities of the same state in this sort of category. New Haven contributes approximately about 15% of the state's carceral population. And New Haven is also considering dissimilarity indexes, and that analysis of New Haven, it is very segregated. It's not the most segregated in the country, but it's very segregated and is unequal. So I think with all that being said, sort of grappling with the police alone is never enough. That we must look at the root causes of inequality and a lack of opportunity and try to make investments there. And there's a number of things, more concrete things there, but I would simply say, not so much as an abstraction, but I would simply say that we need to sort of identify roots of inequality outside of policing. As for policing, I am not an abolitionist. I believe that there's a value for policing. I think about the young Kiana Brown, who was a basketball player. I think she was a senior, and she was roughly 18 or 19 years of age. She was asleep in her house, and she attended one of the high schools here, but she was shot while asleep. And that's unfair. And I think her parent would agree with me. We want police to ensure our safety, because until we have greater equity, we're going to have desperate people. And we're also going to have that small, what Marx calls the lumpen proletariat. This is the sort of small group of people that, in fact, are incorrigible to some extent, or haven't positively been convinced that crime is not an option. So we need police, but we need to also think about how we might divert some of the budget that, for example, New Haven Police enjoys, and reassign that budget to social workers, school counselors, other non-punitive interventions, both in the larger community, but also in the schools. And so we should also consider about having and we actually do have now a civilian review board or civilian review commission here, which is something that we need. We just have to make sure that there is subpoena power and that we, in fact, could enforce officers to be held accountable. And then let me just say that all of the interventions that are being sort of discussed in this sort of national discussion, whether it be making records more transparent. There was, I think, the officer Jason Santiago, who committed the act of violence against a person in custody, was just recently fired. I mean, that's a good step by the chief of New Haven Police. But making records transparent, emphasizing de-escalation, again, defunding is important. And I think everyday citizens need to ride along with police. We need to ride along with the police. I think police, in fact, make for the best ethnographers. They do exactly what ethnographers do, except that they're going after information for punitive reasons, and we use information, or we ferret information out because we want to inform social justice, I would argue. But those are some of the things, and I think this is a great question. I would just simply say that we can't lose hope.
Thank you. Kalfani, Jim Berger has a question. Jim, you want to unmute yourself?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Kalfani. Really interesting talk. Given what you said about, the histories that obviously this country is part of, I guess the question we're all asking is, well, what steps do we need to take to repair this social, historical, racial, economic damage? And is it possible, to go forward unless we on some level go backward and do those acts of, I don't know, is reparation the right word? Is sort of some version of truth and reconciliation that they did in South Africa and elsewhere. But it seems like some sort of historical repair needs to be, some kind of accounting needs to be done. Otherwise, going forward seems kind of empty.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of interventions, I think, or antidotes for blue fragility, which is how do you develop a greater fitness amongst officers to deal with criticism, right? So that's just how do we become more fit. Officers are being trained as ethnographers and advocates for communities. In other words, they have direct access to power, and they can tell you when a street light is out, or when there's infrastructural, when communities are falling into disrepair because of infrastructure, not because of cultural practices or things. They can they have a good sense about the level of unemployment. They're aware of the lack of access to recreation. I think so police officers, in fact, could be ethnographers. But I sort of singled out history here because, our society encourages historical amnesia. We're good at that. In fact, I have before you guys on the screen the deputy sheriff badge, which when I was with Cherokee County Sheriff Department, my badge was very similar to that. Well, if you look at the runaway slave patrol badge, the similarities are striking. And so I put that image there because it's not like sort of history, and the danger in sort of discussing history is that history itself becomes a sort of segmented moment, right? It's something that happened in the past. Well, I want to influence you that yes, history is important because it helps to explain how we got here. But I also think it's important that we understand that it's sort of is self-feeding, right? And that it's reinforcing. Because interestingly enough, during the Great Migration after World War I, and certainly leading into and after World War II, African Americans had by and large been criminalized. And returned to the sort of convict leasing system, but they've been heavily criminalized. And so when they arrived in the northern cities, or in places like Chicago and St. Louis, or Milwaukee, or Camden, or Baltimore, etc., they brought those criminal passes with them, but they weren't criminals, if you get my point here. But they were understood as criminals. And while we had worked to consolidate Central, Southern, and Eastern Europeans into this category of whiteness, and through the New Deal, for example, part of the New Deal and part of, which I didn't mention here, the Wickersham Commission, which looked at corruption in policing, they also looked at the fact that these ethnic Central and Southern Europeans were being exploited. And so the New Deal comes about to try and repair that. And so it offers material rewards to these citizens, along with consolidating them in this sort of redeemable character, right? There's a really great film for this. Elijah Anderson wrote the book Code of the Streets, but there was a movie in 1945 called The Code of the Streets, and it looked at Italian and Irish gang members. And I won't give the whole sort of plot here, but anyway, the story makes the point, or the movie makes the point, that they are redeemable citizens. And so there was this larger campaign to sort of help smoothly consolidate these groups into the category of white. What does all that mean? If you're not attuned to history, even as someone who works a profession that has the license to sort of seize someone's life, if you're not attuned to that history, then you really don't know why there's so much animus against your profession. Like, so when the kids frowned at me, they weren't just frowning at me as quote unquote the traitor or the Uncle Tom or whatever. I got all these names called at, but they were frowning at this history of violence that they were quite aware of. And so I think that officers, if they learn the history, I think we need to have a sort of campaign that all Americans need to learn the history, because outside of blue fragility, we have white fragility. And I think that when we think about those African migrants into the North, they brought criminal passes with them, and people dismissed the fact that there was this sort of continuity of oppression. And they said, oh, well, these African Americans, for example, are bad, not because of systemic issues. They're bad off because of cultural issues. And social scientists played into that. We'd offered all these sort of theories around culture or poverty, whether it be Oscar Lewis at Columbia University, or E. Franklin Frazier, or some contemporary scholars. We fed into this idea that there was this culture of poverty that would explain away the fact that African Americans, unlike ethnic Europeans, weren't able to sort of fit into the mixing pot. We weren't able to become part of the melting pot of all things Americana. Well, because race becomes this sort of, signifier of these sort of criminal people, when in fact the South did everything they could to criminalize them in order to return them to subservient roles. So I think history is important.
I think that's a good stopping point. And I'd like to say thank you very much, Kalfani, for joining us. And I hope that this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation, because you made so many points, and I have the feeling that people are going to have a lot more questions. So we may have to invite you back, and maybe one day we can actually be together in a room together. Imagine that.
So I did want to say that I am part of developing the Center for the Ethnographic Study of Public Safety. And I hope maybe to collaborate with your group in the future as we continue to develop the center to do other things around, with ethnography and public safety. And also events that will, obviously offer a little bit more time to flesh out some of these very complicated issues. But I thank you for the opportunity to speak with to be in communication with you all.
Thank you very much.
I will let you know that we had people asking whether you're writing a book, and if so, they want to know about it. People were who really enjoyed the talk quite a lot, and apologies from people who felt they had to leave only because of time. But we had a lot of very positive feedback. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Kalfani, if you send me information about the center and how we can help you with that, and a way to reach you about that, and also if you are working on books and you want to share the titles,
I sure will.
That would be great. Send me an email and I'll send it out to people.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there are still spaces for people at the blood drive tomorrow.
We want your blood.
All right, thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, Kalfani. Good night, everybody.